The hum of the engines was a hypnotic lullaby, a promise of paradise suspended 35,000 feet above the sleeping American heartland. But on Continental Apex Flight 815 to Honolulu, a storm was brewing inside the pressurized cabin, far more turbulent than any weather pattern. It wasn't a storm of wind or rain, but one of quiet, venomous prejudice. For Dr. Jessica Thompson, a woman who held life and death in her hands daily, the greatest challenge of her career wouldn't be in a sterile operating room, but in the narrow aisle of an airplane under the scornful gaze of a flight attendant who saw only the color of her skin, not the brilliance of her mind. In moments, a life would hang in the balance, and the fate of everyone on board would rest on the shoulders of the very woman who had just been deemed unworthy. The scent of recycled air and brewing coffee filled the first-class cabin of the Boeing 707. Dr. Jessica Thompson settled into seat 3A, a luxurious cocoon of leather and personal space that felt like a world away from the controlled chaos of the cardiac wing at Chicago General Hospital. She sighed a deep, bone-weary exhalation that carried the weight of a 72-hour shift. The Hawaiian vacation was less a luxury and more a doctor's prescription for her own well-being. Her fingers, usually steady over a patient's open chest, traced the rim of her complimentary orange juice glass. She was dressed for comfort, not to impress a soft grey Northwestern University hoodie, comfortable leggings and a pair of worn-out running shoes. The clothes were a silent rebellion against the starched white coat that defined her professional life. Here for the next 8 hours, she was just Jessica, a woman in desperate need of sun sand and the blissful anonymity of being a tourist. The cabin buzzed with the low murmur of pre-flight anticipation. Businessmen in crisp suits typed furiously on their laptops, squeezing in the last few moments of productivity. A honeymooning couple whispered excitedly, their hands intertwined. Jessica watched them with a faint, weary smile. It was a tableau of ordinary life, a comforting reminder that the world continued to turn, even when hers felt like a relentless cycle of emergencies and exhaustion. Her gaze drifted to the flight attendants, preparing the cabin for departure. They moved with a practiced, almost balletic efficiency. One of them, a woman in her late 50s, with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Karen, seemed to command the aisle with an air of unshakable authority. Karen Miller was a senior purser, a veteran of the skies, with 30 years of service pinned to her lapel like a military decoration. She saw the cabin not as a space for passengers, but as her domain, a kingdom she ruled with a sharp eye and an even sharper tongue. Her smile, when she offered it, didn't quite reach her cold, assessing blue eyes. She moved through the cabin, her posture ramrod straight, her expression a carefully maintained mask of professional pleasantry that barely concealed a simmering impatience. As Jessica settled in, pulling a thick medical journal from her carry-on, she noticed Karen's gaze linger on her for a moment, too long. It was a fleeting glance, but it was laden with something Jessica couldn't quite decipher. A flicker of surprise, perhaps. Or was it disapproval Jessica was used to being an anomaly in certain spaces? A black woman, and a young one at that, in the upper echelons of a competitive surgical field, was still a sight that gave some people pause. She had learned to ignore the subtle slights, the surprise in people's eyes, when she introduced herself as Dr. Thompson, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery. She chose to believe it was simple curiosity, not malice. "Ma'am," a crisp voice cut through her thoughts. Jessica looked up. It was Karen standing beside her seat, holding a passenger manifest on a tablet. "Can I see your boarding pass again, please?" Jessica blinked. Of course. She had already shown it to the gate agent and the attendant at the aircraft door. She retrieved the paper from her bag and handed it over. Karen studied it intently. Her lips pursed. She cross-referenced it with her tablet, tapping the screen with a manicured finger. The silence stretched, becoming awkward. The man in seat 3B, a portly gentleman in a golf shirt, glanced over, a curious frown on his face. "Everything all right?" Jessica asked, her voice even. "Just double-checking." Karen replied, her tone clipped. She handed the pass back without making eye contact. "We've had some issues with seat duplications recently." It was a plausible excuse, yet it felt hollow. Jessica watched her walk away, a familiar, unpleasant feeling coiling in her stomach. She tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to Karen's diligence or her own exhaustion-fueled paranoia. She was on vacation. She refused to let anything spoil it. The captain's voice, a deep, reassuring baritone, crackled over the PA system, announcing their flight time and cruising altitude. The safety demonstration video played the smiling faces on the screen, a stark contrast to the stony expression of the senior purser. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Jessica leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the ground crew shrink into tiny figures. The roar of the engines built to a crescendo, and with a powerful surge of thrust, Flight 855 lifted off the ground, leaving the grey sprawl of Chicago behind. As they ascended through the clouds, breaking into the brilliant, unfiltered sunshine of the upper atmosphere, the cabin crew began their service. Another flight attendant, a younger woman named Maria, with a warm, genuine smile, offered Jessica a warm towel and a pre-departure drink. Jessica accepted with a grateful nod. The tension in her shoulders began to ease. Maybe she had misread the situation. But then Karen returned her service cart, gliding silently down the aisle. When she reached Jessica's row, she served the man in 3B, first engaging him in a brief, cheerful conversation about the weather in Honolulu. Then she turned to Jessica. The professional smile was back, but her eyes were like chips of ice. "And for you?" she asked, her voice a full 2 octaves higher than when she spoke to the man. It was the kind of overly solicitous tone one might use with a child or someone who didn't quite belong. "I'll just have a ginger ale, please," Jessica said, keeping her tone neutral. Karen poured the drink, her movements brisk and efficient. As she handed the glass to Jessica, her thumb brushed against the rim. She pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned. A look of faint disgust flashing across her face before being quickly masked. It was another small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it landed like a physical blow. The message was clear. You are not welcome here. You are an intrusion. Jessica took a slow sip of her drink, the bubbles fizzing on her tongue. The medical journal lay open in her lap, its dense text and complex diagrams a comforting shield. She had built her entire life on facts, on evidence, on the irrefutable logic of science. She had dissected the human heart, held it beating in her hands, and stitched it back together. She had stared down death and won. She would not be undone by the petty prejudices of a flight attendant. She turned the page, immersing herself in an article on mitral valve prolapse, determined to create her own calm before the inevitable storm. The hum of the engines was no longer a lullaby. It was the sound of a clock ticking down to a crisis she could never have anticipated. The flight continued its smooth westward arc across the sky. Lunch was served, a surprisingly palatable grilled salmon for first class. Jessica ate quietly, focusing on the movie playing on her screen, a mindless comedy that required zero emotional or intellectual investment. It was the perfect escape. Yet she couldn't completely shake the feeling of being watched, of being judged. Every time Karen passed down the aisle, Jessica could feel her eyes on her. It was a heavy, oppressive scrutiny. The man in 3B, a friendly real estate developer named George, struck up a conversation. He was on his way to a conference, a working vacation, he called it with a chuckle. "And you?" he asked, gesturing with his fork. "Business or pleasure?" "Pleasure," Jessica replied, offering a small smile. "Definitely pleasure. I'm a doctor. I haven't had a real vacation in 3 years." George's eyebrows shot up. "A doctor? Wow, that's impressive. What's your specialty?" "I'm a heart surgeon," she said simply. "No kidding," he boomed, clearly impressed. "A heart surgeon. You look so young. That's fantastic. We're in good hands if anything happens then." He laughed heartily. From the corner of her eye, Jessica saw Karen pause by the galley curtain, her posture stiffening. She had overheard. Jessica felt a prickle of annoyance. Her profession was a source of pride, but it was also at times a burden. It invited a certain kind of attention, and today it felt like it was attracting the wrong kind. An hour later, Jessica decided to stretch her legs. She made her way towards the lavatory at the front of the cabin. Karen was in the galley, meticulously polishing silverware, her back to the aisle. As Jessica passed, Karen turned, and a forced, saccharine smile stretched across her face. "Everything to your satisfaction, ma'am?" she asked. The ma'am was laced with a cloying sweetness that felt more like an insult than a courtesy. "Yes, thank you. Everything's fine," Jessica replied, her voice polite but cool. She waited for the lavatory to become free. When she came out, Karen was still there now, arranging miniature bottles of liquor in a drawer. She didn't look up, but she spoke, her voice low and conspiratorial, as if sharing a piece of gossip. "You know," Karen began, her hands still busy. "It's amazing who ends up in first class these days. The airline has all these new upgrade programs, partnerships with credit cards, employee buddy passes. It really dilutes the experience, you know." She finally looked up, her eyes meeting Jessica's in the small galley mirror. "It's not as exclusive as it used to be." The implication was as sharp and sterile as a scalpel. Jessica felt a hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks. The hoodie, the leggings, her skin color. It all coalesced in Karen's mind into a single dismissive narrative. This woman did not pay for her seat. This woman did not belong. Jessica leaned against the bulkhead, crossing her arms. She refused to be intimidated. She met Karen's gaze directly, her voice dropping to a quiet, firm register. "I'm sure it is, but you shouldn't worry about me. I paid full fare, with money I earned." A flicker of surprise crossed Karen's face, quickly replaced by a defensive sneer. "Well, of course. I wasn't implying." "Weren't you?" Jessica pressed her patience wearing thin. "It sounded an awful lot like you were." Karen straightened up her professional mask, slipping to reveal the ugliness beneath. Her voice dripped with condescension. "I was just making an observation about the airline's policies. Some people are so sensitive." She turned her back on Jessica, a clear act of dismissal, and began counting napkins with exaggerated focus. The insult, though veiled in corporate jargon and faux pleasantry, had been delivered. It was a calculated move designed to put Jessica in her place, to remind her that in Karen's small airborne kingdom, she was an outsider. Jessica stood there for a moment, her fists clenched at her sides. She could make a scene. She could demand to speak to the captain. She could file a formal complaint. Her mind, trained to assess and react, ran through the options. But the exhaustion was a heavy blanket. A confrontation would solve nothing. It would only escalate the tension and ruin the first day of her much-needed rest. She returned to her seat, her heart pounding with a frustration she hadn't felt in years. She had faced down racist patients, skeptical colleagues, and dismissive attendings throughout her career. She had developed a thick skin. But there was something about the enclosed space of the airplane, the utter powerlessness of being a passenger, that made this feel different, more insidious. She picked up her journal again, but the words swam before her eyes. The man in 3B was asleep, a light snore escaping his lips. The cabin was quiet, peaceful. But for Jessica, the air had become toxic. Karen's words echoed in her mind. It's not as exclusive as it used to be. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption of her inferiority, was breathtaking. Later, as the crew prepared for the mid-flight beverage service, Jessica heard Karen talking to Maria in the galley. The curtain wasn't fully closed, and Karen's voice, sharp and carrying, cut through the engine's drone. "Says she's a heart surgeon," Karen scoffed. Jessica could practically hear the eye roll. "Right, probably a nurse or maybe one of those online doctorates. She looks barely old enough to be out of college. People will say anything to sound important." Maria murmured something indistinct, a softer, placating tone. But Karen's judgment had been passed. In her mind, the narrative was set. Dr. Jessica Thompson, a leader in her field, a woman who had spent over a decade in grueling training to save lives, had been reduced to a liar, an unqualified pretender who had somehow lucked her way into seat 3A. The calm was officially over. The storm had arrived. The aircraft was somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, a tiny speck of humanity, suspended between an endless blue sky and an equally endless blue sea. The halfway point of the journey had passed. Most passengers were lulled into a state of drowsy contentment by the altitude and the dull roar of the engines. Some watched movies, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of their screens. Others slept their heads lolling at awkward angles. The rhythm of the flight was placid, predictable. Jessica had managed to push Karen's venomous words to the back of her mind, finding refuge in a deep, if troubled, sleep. She was dreaming of the ocean of waves washing away the stress of the hospital when a sudden commotion jolted her awake. It started with a choked gasp, followed by a clatter of silverware hitting the floor. Jessica's eyes snapped open. Her senses, honed by years of emergency room chaos, were instantly on high alert. A few rows behind her in the premium economy cabin, just beyond the first-class curtain, a woman screamed. "Henry! Oh my God! Henry, what's wrong?" Heads turned. The low hum of the cabin was shattered by rising panic. Flight attendants, including Maria and another attendant named Tom, rushed toward the source of the commotion. Jessica was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her medical instincts overriding her passenger status. She stood up and looked over the seats. She could see a man, elderly perhaps, in his late 70s, slumped in his aisle seat. His face was a ghastly shade of grey, beaded with sweat. His eyes were wide with terror, and his left hand was clenched tightly over the center of his chest. His wife, a frantic woman with white hair, was trying to talk to him, her voice trembling. "He can't breathe," she cried out to the approaching flight attendants. "He says his chest hurts." Classic signs, unmistakable. Myocardial infarction, a heart attack. Jessica's mind went into clinical mode, shutting out the surrounding panic. Location symptoms, patient demographics. The data points clicked into place with chilling speed. Karen Miller emerged from the forward galley, her face a mask of controlled authority. She moved with a purpose that bordered on aggression, parting the small crowd of concerned passengers that had started to form in the aisle. "Everyone, please return to your seats," she commanded, her voice sharp. "Give us some room to work." She knelt beside the stricken man, whose name was apparently Henry. Sir, can you hear me?" "My name is Karen. I'm the purser on this flight. Can you tell me what's happening?" Henry could only gasp, his breathing shallow and ragged. He pointed a trembling finger to his chest. "Pain. Arm," he wheezed. The radiating pain down the arm was another textbook symptom. This was bad. They were hours from the nearest major hospital. Every second counted. Tom, the other flight attendant, appeared with a first aid kit. Karen quickly took charge. "Get the defibrillator and the oxygen tank now," she ordered Maria. The cabin was now fully awake, the atmosphere thick with fear and anxiety. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Is he okay? What's happening? Is it a heart attack?" Karen's voice cut through the noise again, this time addressing the entire aircraft via the PA system from a cabin handset. Her voice was steady but laced with an urgency that betrayed the gravity of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical situation on board. Your attention, please. Is there a medical professional on the flight? If there is a doctor, a nurse, or a paramedic on board, please identify yourself to a member of the flight crew immediately." She repeated the message. The man in seat 3B, George, who was now wide awake, turned to Jessica. His eyes were wide. "That's you," he whispered, his voice awed. "They need you." Jessica was already moving. She stepped into the aisle, her heart pounding a steady, familiar rhythm against her ribs. This was her world. This was what she was trained for. The location was unconventional. The resources were limited, but the mission was the same: save a life. She approached the scene where Karen was now trying to loosen the man's shirt collar. "I'm a doctor," Jessica said, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the panicked chatter. Karen looked up from her position on the floor. Her eyes clouded with the stress of the emergency scanned Jessica from head to toe. She took in the university hoodie, the leggings, the running shoes, and then her gaze hardened. The flicker of recognition in her eyes was not one of relief, but of profound, unadulterated disbelief. The emergency did not erase her prejudice. It magnified it. "I'm a doctor," Jessica repeated more firmly this time. "I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. Let me help him." The crisis at 35,000 feet had just found its physician, but it had also found its greatest obstacle, and she was kneeling right in front of her. A tense, surreal silence fell over the small, crowded space around seat 12C. The distressed gasps of the passenger Henry were the only sounds punctuating the standoff. Karen Miller stared up at Jessica, her face a mixture of shock and undisguised skepticism. For a fraction of a second, Jessica saw a flicker of desperation in the flight attendant's eyes, a silent plea for this to be a solution. But it was instantly extinguished, smothered by a lifetime of ingrained prejudice. "A surgeon." Karen repeated the word as if it were a foreign and highly suspect term. Her eyes narrowed. "I need to see some identification, some proof." The request, while technically within protocol, was delivered with a tone of accusation. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. "Of course," Jessica replied, her own voice tight with a blend of professional calm and rising fury. She reached into the small crossbody bag she still wore and pulled out her wallet. She flipped it open to her hospital ID, Dr. Jessica Thompson, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery, Chicago General Hospital, and her state medical license. She held it out for Karen to see. Karen barely glanced at them. "These can be faked," she snapped, her voice low and sharp. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "We can't just let anyone claiming to be a doctor interfere. It's a massive liability." Henry let out a pained groan, his face contorting. His wife sobbed beside him. "Please," she begged, looking from Karen to Jessica. "Help him. Do something." "Ma'am, we have the situation under control," Karen said, turning her attention back to the suffering man, effectively dismissing Jessica. "We're following our training." Jessica's blood ran cold. Following training. Their training was basic first aid designed to keep someone stable. This man was in the middle of a major cardiac event. He needed expert intervention, and he needed it 10 seconds ago. The window to prevent irreversible heart muscle damage was closing with every beat of his failing heart. "You don't have this under control." Jessica's voice was like steel. It cut through Karen's flimsy facade of authority and made both Maria and Tom, who had just returned with the oxygen and defibrillator, freeze in their tracks. "That man is having a ST elevation myocardial infarction. Look at his jugular venous distension and the pallor of his skin. He's going into cardiogenic shock. Your training is not going to save him. I can." The clinical terminology, the sheer confidence in her diagnosis, seemed to momentarily stun Karen into silence, but she recovered quickly, her bigotry a more powerful force than reason. "I don't know what any of that means," she retorted, her voice rising. "And frankly, you don't look like any surgeon I've ever seen." The insult was finally laid bare, stripped of its veils and subtleties. "You don't look like a surgeon. Because surgeons weren't young. Because surgeons weren't women. Because surgeons weren't black." "What exactly does a surgeon look like?" Jessica shot back, her voice dangerously quiet. Before Karen could answer the co-pilot, a man named Frank Morrison appeared from the cockpit, alerted to the crisis. "What's the situation, Karen? We have a passenger with chest pains," Karen reported, standing up to meet him, positioning herself between Jessica and the cockpit door. "This person," she gestured contemptuously towards Jessica, "is claiming to be a doctor, but she can't provide credentials." "That's a lie," Jessica said, stepping forward. "I showed her my hospital ID and my medical license. My name is Dr. Jessica Thompson. I am a heart surgeon at Chicago General. You can call the hospital to verify, but you don't have time for that. This man needs medical attention right now, or he will die on this airplane." Frank, the co-pilot, looked from Karen's rigid, hostile face to Jessica's intense, commanding one. He saw the credentials still in her hand. He was a pilot, a man trained to make rapid, life-or-death decisions based on the available data. He saw a passenger in clear distress, a flight attendant creating a bottleneck, and a woman speaking with the unmistakable authority of an expert. "Karen," he said, his voice firm. "Let her help." Karen's face crumpled in fury. To be overruled and in front of passengers was the ultimate humiliation. "Frank, our protocol is clear." "Protocol also says we utilize any qualified medical professionals on board," Frank interrupted. "And right now, she's the only one we've got. The captain agrees. We're diverting to Denver, but that's still over an hour away. Let her work. That's an order." He looked at Jessica. "Doctor, we're at your disposal. What do you need?" The shift in power was instantaneous and absolute. Karen's face was a thundercloud of repressed rage her authority usurped. She was forced to step aside, her body rigid with indignation. Jessica didn't waste a second gloating. She was already kneeling beside Henry, her focus entirely on the patient. The title of her story had been written in that moment. She was the savior, but in the eyes of the woman forced to assist her, she would forever be unqualified. The irony was as bitter as bile. She had to save this man's life, and she had to do it with her biggest detractor as her unwilling assistant. "I need the medical kit, the defibrillator, and the oxygen. Now," Jessica commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Her attention was solely on Henry. She gently placed 2 fingers on his neck, feeling for the carotid artery. His pulse was thready and rapid. Tachycardia. His breathing was shallow. Hypoxia. "Henry, my name is Dr. Thompson. I'm a heart doctor. I'm going to help you," she said, her voice calm and reassuring, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions she felt internally. She needed to establish trust with her patient, even if he was barely conscious. Mariah and Tom, looking relieved to have a clear leader, quickly brought the equipment. Karen stood by her arms, crossed, her expression sullen. "I need you to help," Jessica said, looking directly at Karen without malice, only a professional demand. "I need you to hold the oxygen mask over his mouth and nose, and I need you to be my second set of hands. Can you do that?" For a moment it looked as though Karen might refuse. Pride and prejudice warred on her face, but the co-pilot was still standing there, a silent observer, and the eyes of every nearby passenger were fixed on her. Trapped, she snatched the oxygen mask from Maria and knelt stiffly on the other side of Henry. Jessica worked with astonishing speed and precision. "Aspirin," she said, her hand out. "The kit should have 350 chewable aspirin." Tom fumbled with the medical kit, his hands shaking slightly. He found the bottle and handed it to her. "Henry, I need you to chew these," Jessica instructed, putting the tablets in his hand. "Don't swallow, just chew. It would help thin his blood and break up the clot forming in his coronary artery." Next, she attached the pads of the automated external defibrillator AED to Henry's chest, her movements swift and sure. "Don't turn it on yet," she told Tom. "It's a precaution. His rhythm could degrade at any moment." She took out the stethoscope and blood pressure cuff from the kit. The aisle was cramped, the lighting was dim, and the constant vibration of the plane made it difficult, but she managed to get a reading. "Blood pressure is 80/50. It's dangerously low. He's in shock." She looked at Henry's wife, whose name she learned was Eleanor. "Eleanor does. Henry have any history of heart problems? Does he take any medication? Nitroglycerin, perhaps?" Eleanor, her face streaked with tears, nodded frantically. Yes, he has a prescription. It's in his carry-on bag in the overhead." "Get it," Jessica ordered Tom. While he retrieved the bag, Jessica turned her attention to Karen. "I need you to help me lay him flat in the aisle. We need to elevate his legs to get more blood to his heart." Karen hesitated, a look of revulsion on her face at the prospect of being so hands-on. "Now." Jessica's voice was sharp, a surgeon's command in the operating room. Together they carefully maneuvered Henry's limp body from the seat onto the floor. It was an awkward, clumsy process in the confined space. Once he was down, Jessica propped his feet up on a roll-aboard bag. The change in position seemed to help slightly. The deep grey of his skin lightened a fraction. Tom returned with a small pill bottle. Nitroglycerin. "Okay, 1 tablet under his tongue," Jessica directed. "The vasodilator would open up his arteries and hopefully improve blood flow to his struggling heart muscle." For the next hour, Jessica Thompson transformed the aisle of Flight 815 into a makeshift intensive care unit. She was a whirlwind of focused energy, a stark contrast to the paralyzed fear that had gripped the cabin moments before. She monitored Henry's vitals constantly, calling out blood pressure readings and oxygen saturation levels. She directed Tom and Maria with simple, clear instructions, turning them into an effective medical team. She reassured Eleanor, explaining what she was doing in simple terms, her calm demeanor a comforting anchor in the terrifying storm. And through it all, Karen was there, forced into the role of a nurse's aide. She followed Jessica's orders, her movements stiff and resentful. She held the IV bag when Jessica skillfully inserted a saline lock into a vein in Henry's arm, a feat of incredible difficulty on a moving plane. She passed instruments from the medical kit. She held the flashlight steady. With every successful procedure, with every moment, Henry remained stable. Jessica could feel Karen's silent, begrudging humiliation grow. This woman, this unqualified person in a hoodie, was performing a medical miracle in front of her very eyes, and she was an unwilling participant in her triumph. Suddenly, the AED, which had been quietly monitoring Henry's heart rhythm, blared to life. A robotic voice filled the cabin. "Shock advised. Charging. Stand clear." Henry's body had gone rigid. His eyes rolled back in his head. "He's in V-fib," Jessica shouted. Ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic, fatal heart rhythm. "Everyone stand back." She checked to make sure no one was touching Henry. Karen scrambled backwards, her face pale with shock. "Clear!" Jessica yelled, pressing the flashing orange button on the machine. Henry's body convulsed as the electric current surged through his chest. For a terrifying second there was nothing. Then a beep. A steady, regular beep from the monitor. "We have a rhythm." Jessica breathed, a wave of relief washing over her. She immediately began chest compressions, putting her entire body weight into the rhythmic pumping. "Someone time me for 2 minutes. Then we switch." The race against time was on. For the next 20 minutes, as the plane began its steep descent towards Denver. Jessica, Tom, and even George from seat 3B took turns performing CPR, a brutal, exhausting dance of survival at 35,000 feet. Jessica was the conductor, counting out compressions, managing the airway, and keeping everyone focused, her voice never wavering. She had saved him from the brink, and she was not going to lose him now. The captain's voice came over the PA, calm and authoritative, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our final descent into Denver International Airport. Paramedics and emergency services will be meeting us at the gate. Please remain in your seats until the professionals have boarded and the patient has been safely deplaned." Jessica was slick with sweat, her muscles aching from the exertion of continuous CPR. But Henry Harrison was alive. His pulse was weak but steady, and the color had returned to his face. He was breathing on his own with the help of the oxygen mask. She had stabilized him, pulling him back from the very edge of death. As the plane's wheels screeched against the tarmac, a ripple of applause and audible sighs of relief spread through the cabin. Passengers who had watched the entire drama unfold stared at Jessica with expressions of awe and gratitude. The moment the plane docked at the gate, the cabin door was thrown open. A team of paramedics, their faces grim and focused, swarmed in their equipment, clattering. "What do we have?" the lead paramedic, a burly man named Mike, asked as he knelt beside Jessica. Jessica, still on her knees, gave a rapid, concise, and professional handover. "Male late 70s witnessed collapse. Presented with severe chest pain, radiating to the left arm. History of angina on nitroglycerin. BP dropped to 80/50, gave aspirin and 1 sublingual nitro. Went into V-fib, 1 shock, administered via AED, followed by 20 minutes of CPR. Sinus rhythm restored post-shock. Vitals have been stable for the last 10 minutes. Mike's eyebrows shot up in respect. He looked from the stabilized patient to the young woman in the university hoodie. "You did all that in the air?" "I'm a cardiac surgeon," Jessica said simply. "Well, doctor," Mike said with a nod of profound admiration. "You just saved this man's life, no question." They efficiently transferred Henry onto a stretcher. As they were about to wheel him off the plane, a man in an expensive tailored suit pushed his way past the deplaning passengers and onto the jet bridge, his face pale with anxiety. He was followed by several airport officials. "Where is he? Where's my father?" the man demanded, his eyes scanning the cabin frantically. Karen Miller, who had been standing by the galley trying to make herself invisible, stepped forward. Her professional demeanor snapped back into place. "Sir, you can't be on the aircraft yet." The man brushed past her as if she were a piece of furniture. His eyes landed on the stretcher. "Dad!" He rushed to Henry's side, grabbing his hand. "Dad, it's Robert. Can you hear me?" Henry's eyelids fluttered open. He gave a weak squeeze. Robert turned to the paramedics. "I'm Robert Harrison. That's my father, Henry Harrison. We have the best cardiology team at Colorado General standing by." He then looked around, his gaze falling on Jessica, who was gathering her things, her adrenaline finally starting to wane. "Who helped him?" "The crew said someone performed CPR." The lead paramedic, Mike, gestured with his head towards Jessica. "That would be this lady right here, sir. Dr. Thompson. If it weren't for her, your father wouldn't have made it to the ground." Robert Harrison's eyes filled with tears of relief locked onto Jessica's. He was the CEO of Continental Apex Airlines. The name was instantly recognizable. And his father, the man whose life Jessica had just saved, was not just any passenger. Henry Harrison was the airline's founder and a revered member of its board of directors. A cold, sickening dread washed over Karen Miller's face. She looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. The blood drained from her face, leaving her with a pasty, horrified complexion. She had not just insulted a passenger. She had not just tried to block a doctor from saving a life. She had done it to the founder of the airline, right in front of the CEO, who happened to be his son. Robert Harrison approached Jessica. His hand extended. His gratitude was immense and palpable. "Dr. Thompson," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't have the words. You saved my father. I am in your debt. Anything you need, anything at all." Jessica, exhausted, simply shook her head. "I'm just glad I was here and could help." "No, you don't understand," Robert insisted. "The flight crew radioed ahead. They told us about the situation and about the difficulties." His eyes flickered for a brief second towards Karen, a gaze as cold and hard as a diamond. He had clearly been briefed on more than just the medical details. In that moment, Karen Miller understood that her career was over. 30 years of service of ruling her airborne kingdom had evaporated in a single catastrophic lapse of judgment. The woman she had dismissed, insulted, and deemed unqualified had not only proven her worth in the most dramatic way imaginable, but had done so by saving the one person on that plane who held Karen's entire world in the palm of his hand. The emergency was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The next 24 hours were a blur for Jessica. Robert Harrison had insisted she stay in Denver, putting her up in a luxurious suite at the Four Seasons and canceling her Hawaiian vacation himself, promising a future trip of her choosing to anywhere in the world on his private jet. He had also insisted she come to the hospital for a debrief with his father's cardiology team, who were unanimous in their praise. They confirmed her diagnosis and stated in no uncertain terms that her swift and expert intervention was the sole reason Henry Harrison had survived with almost no lasting damage to his heart. While Jessica was being lauded as a hero, a very different scene was unfolding at the Continental Apex Airlines corporate headquarters near the Denver airport. An emergency internal investigation was launched before Flight 815's remaining passengers had even been rebooked on a new flight to Honolulu. Robert Harrison was a man known for his calm, calculated business demeanor. But when it came to his family and the integrity of his company, he was ruthless. Passenger statements were taken immediately. George from seat 3B gave a detailed, damning account of Karen's initial skepticism and her condescending remarks. Several other first-class passengers corroborated his story, recounting the boarding pass incident and the general hostility they had witnessed. Maria and Tom, the other flight attendants, were interviewed separately. Terrified but truthful, they recounted Karen's dismissive comments in the galley, her refusal to believe Jessica, and her open defiance of the co-pilot's order. Co-pilot Frank Morrison's official report was a clinical, brutal indictment of Karen's behavior, which he labeled a dangerous and unprecedented obstruction during a critical in-flight emergency. The nail in the coffin, however, came from the plane's own systems. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, though typically overwritten, had its data for the last half hour of the flight immediately pulled by investigators. The audio from the cabin PA system and the crew's inter-cabin communication was crystal clear. It captured Karen's initial call, Jessica's calm identification of herself as a doctor, and the tense, hostile exchange that followed. It was irrefutable. The following afternoon, Karen Miller was summoned to a sterile, glass-walled conference room. On one side of the vast mahogany table sat Robert Harrison, flanked by the airline's head of in-flight services and a severe-looking corporate attorney. Karen sat alone on the other side. Her 30-year service pin gleamed on her uniform, a stark reminder of everything she was about to lose. "Ms. Miller," Robert began, his voice devoid of all warmth, "we have concluded our investigation into the events on Flight 815. We have spoken to passengers, your fellow crew members, and we have reviewed the official flight recorder data." He slid a tablet across the table. It was a transcript of her conversation with Jessica. Her own words, typed out in cold black letters, stared back at her. "These can be faked. You don't look like any surgeon I've ever seen." Karen's face, already pale, turned ashen. I was under stress," she stammered. "I was just trying to follow protocol to ensure the safety of the passengers." "Whose safety, Ms. Miller?" the attorney cut in, his voice sharp. "Because it seems the only person whose safety you endangered was Henry Harrison. You actively and with clear prejudice attempted to prevent a board-certified cardiothoracic surgeon from rendering life-saving aid. Your personal bias nearly cost my client's father his life." "That's not true," Karen protested, her voice cracking. "I didn't." "You judged a woman based on her age, her gender, and the color of her skin," Robert Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "You decided she was unqualified because she didn't fit your narrow, outdated stereotype of what a doctor should look like. That hoodie she was wearing. It was from Northwestern's Feinberg School of Medicine, one of the top medical schools in the country, where she also happens to be a clinical professor. The woman you called a liar holds the lives of people like my father in her hands every single day. You, on the other hand, serve coffee and enforce the seatbelt sign." The words were brutal, designed to strip away every last shred of her pride. "Continental Apex Airlines has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind," he continued, standing up. "Your actions were not just a violation of company policy. They were a violation of basic human decency. They have exposed this company to massive liability and have tarnished our reputation. As of this moment, your employment is terminated effective immediately. You will be escorted from the building." And just like that, it was over. 30 years in the sky finished in a 3-minute meeting. There was no appeal, no severance package, only the cold, hard reality of karma. As she was escorted out, a news van was pulling up to the building. A passenger from the flight had live tweeted the entire ordeal, and the story of the heroic black doctor and the racist flight attendant had gone viral. Karen Miller's name and face were about to become symbols of modern-day prejudice. That evening, Jessica sat with Robert Harrison in his father's private hospital room. Henry was sitting up in bed, looking tired but remarkably well. He held Jessica's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," the old man whispered. His eyes filled with a sincere, profound gratitude that brought tears to Jessica's own. "You are an angel." Robert explained what had transpired with Karen, not with any sense of glee, but with a somber finality. He also informed Jessica that the airline was making a $2 million donation in her name to a foundation she had co-founded, which provided scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in medicine. "It's the least we can do," Robert said. "We have to do better. Your experience has forced a company-wide review of our diversity and inclusion training. What you endured will, I promise you, be a catalyst for change." As Jessica flew home the next day in first class on a ticket for life, she reflected on the whirlwind of events. The anger and humiliation she had felt were still there, but they were now overshadowed by a sense of vindication. It was a harsh and ugly reminder that prejudice still existed lurking beneath the surface of polite society. But it was also a powerful testament to the triumph of skill, professionalism, and grace under pressure. She hadn't asked to be a hero. She had simply been a doctor. And in the end, that was more than enough. The karma that had hit Karen Miller wasn't mystical or magical. It was simple, direct, and devastatingly real, a direct consequence of her own ugly beliefs delivered back to her in the coldest, most public way imaginable. 1 year later, the sterile scent of recycled air on an airplane was no longer a source of tension for Dr. Jessica Thompson. It was instead a reminder. She sat not in the plush leather of first class, but on a temporary stage in a vast convention hall in Atlanta, the keynote speaker for the National Association of Minority Medical Professionals. The applause that followed her introduction was a thunderous wave of support from 1,000 faces who knew her story, who had seen parts of their own struggles reflected in her viral moment of crisis and vindication. The past year had reshaped her life in ways she never anticipated. The $2 million donation from Continental Apex had supercharged her foundation, allowing them to fund the entire medical school education for a dozen brilliant underprivileged students, the first class of Thompson scholars. Her clinic hours were still punishing her surgical schedule, still demanding. But now her calendar was also filled with mentorship meetings, board appointments, and speaking engagements like this one. She had been given a platform, and she had chosen to use it not to dwell on the ugliness of that day, but to build a ladder for those coming up behind her. Her friendship with Robert Harrison had solidified into a powerful alliance. He had been true to his word. The Apex Inclusivity Initiative was now a mandatory, rigorous training program for all 15,000 of the airline's cabin crew members. Its centerpiece was a simulation based on Flight 815. Trainees listened to the actual audio from the CVR, hearing the panic, the prejudice, and the professionalism in a raw, undeniable form. They heard Karen Miller's challenge and Dr. Jessica Thompson's calm, life-saving response. The lesson was visceral bias isn't just bad service. It can be fatal. Robert had even asked Jessica to help design the medical emergency portions of the training, and her recorded voice now guided new flight attendants through the protocols of responding to a cardiac event. Henry Harrison had made a full recovery. He and Jessica spoke on the phone once a month. He had sent her a photo of himself holding his newborn great-granddaughter, a picture that now sat on her desk at the hospital. On the back, he had written, "To the woman who gave me this moment, thank you." It was, she felt, the only reward that had ever truly mattered. And what of Karen Miller? Her public shaming had been swift and brutal. Fired and disgraced, she became unemployable in the airline industry or any significant customer service role. The digital footprint of her actions was indelible. She had sold her comfortable suburban home to pay for legal fees in a failed wrongful termination lawsuit, and now lived in a small nondescript apartment complex 2 states away. The authority she once wielded over a metal tube in the sky was gone, replaced by the anonymity of a night shift manager at a cavernous 24-hour big box store. She now ruled over aisles of cleaning supplies and discounted electronics, her voice once sharp with command, now a monotone drone over a crackling intercom announcing a cleanup on aisle 7. Some nights, standing under the hum of the unforgiving fluorescent lights, she would see a young black woman in a hoodie come through her checkout lane, and a flicker of the old bitterness would ignite in her chest. She never saw her own prejudice as the cause of her downfall. In the warped narrative she had constructed, she was the victim, a casualty of a hypersensitive, politically correct world that had conspired against her. She wasn't a bigot. She was just old school. Dr. Jessica Thompson wasn't a hero. She was just lucky. The world had changed, and it had left her behind a relic of a bygone era, cloaked in resentment and the faint smell of floor polish. Jessica finished her speech not with a recount of her ordeal, but with a call to action. "Our qualifications," she said, her voice resonating with quiet power, "are written on our diplomas and proven in our actions. They are not defined by the biases of others. Let your excellence be your only reply. Let the lives you save, the discoveries you make, and the students you mentor be the echo of your presence. Make it so loud it drowns out any voice that dares to tell you that you don't belong." As she walked off the stage to another standing ovation, she thought of Karen Miller for a fleeting moment. She felt not anger, not even pity, but a profound sense of sorrow for a life so constrained by its own narrow vision. The echo of Flight 815 had propelled Jessica to new heights, while for Karen it was just the lonely, unending sound of her own fall. The story of Flight 815 is a stark and powerful reminder that our deepest prejudices can have life or death consequences. Dr. Jessica Thompson boarded a plane for a vacation only to be met with a contempt rooted in ignorance. Yet when crisis struck, she rose above the ugliness, her skill and humanity shining through. Her triumph and Karen Miller's spectacular downfall wasn't just a twist of fate. It was the inevitable outcome when professionalism collides with prejudice. It's a story about the heroes who walk among us every day, often in plain sight, their worth measured not by the clothes they wear or the color of their skin, but by their character and their capabilities. What happened at 35,000 feet serves as a lesson for us all. It compels us to look past our own biases and to champion competence and decency wherever we find it. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and share it with others. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories that matter. More importantly, share your own experiences in the comments below. How have you seen professionalism triumph over prejudice in your own life? Your story could be the one that inspires someone else.